There is a particular kind of laughter that has nothing to do with humor. It doesn't burst. It doesn't fill a room with warmth or roll across a dinner table and invite you in. No, this kind of laughter arrives quietly, the way a verdict does, measured, unhurried, absolutely certain of itself. It is the laughter of people who have already made up their minds about you and simply cannot be bothered to hide it anymore. That was the laughter that met me on a Thursday evening, at a dinner table that smelled of rosemary and roasted garlic, in a house where I had never once felt entirely welcome. I'd brought wine. I always brought wine. Partly because it was good manners, partly because it gave me something to do with my hands during the long stretches of conversation I was never quite invited into. I set it on the sideboard, smoothed my jacket, and took my seat between my husband, Daniel, and the window that looked out onto their perfectly maintained garden. His mother, Margaret, had made lamb. She always made lamb when she wanted to signal that an occasion mattered. Her husband, Robert, sat at the head of the table, as he always did, with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved the chair. We were barely through the first course when it started. I had mentioned, briefly, in the lull between passing the bread and pouring the second round of wine, that I'd had a productive week, that I'd been in back-to-back calls, that a restructuring I'd been working on for several months had finally been executed cleanly. I hadn't gone into detail. I rarely did, but I'd said enough for Margaret to pick up the thread. "That thing of yours," she said, not unkindly, but with the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to be kind. "The business." "Yes," I said. She reached for her glass, held it at the stem the way people do when they're about to say something they've been holding for a while. "I just wonder sometimes," she began, "what exactly it is you're doing, all day, on that laptop of yours." She paused. "What it amounts to." I waited. "Pointless," she said. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look away. She said it the way someone states the weather, observable, indisputable, not worth arguing. And then she set her glass down precisely and picked up her fork. Robert smiled, that small, sideways smile he had, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "At least she stays busy," he offered, as though that were a comfort, as though being busy were a consolation prize for failing to be meaningful. And I looked at Daniel. My husband, the man who had sat across from me at our kitchen table 100 mornings, who had watched me take calls at 6 a.m. and answer emails at midnight, who had seen the years of work that had gone into building something real. The man who, I had believed, or perhaps simply hoped, understood more than he ever let on. He didn't say a word. He didn't stiffen. He didn't put his fork down and look at his mother with that quiet, steady expression that says, "That's enough." He didn't even look uncomfortable. He kept eating, methodically, as if this were simply the shape of an ordinary Thursday, as if I were not sitting right next to him, as if what had just been said required no response, no intervention, no acknowledgement whatsoever. That told me everything. Not the cruelty of his parents. I had long ago mapped the edges of that. It was Daniel's stillness, his effortless, unbothered neutrality, the ease with which he had learned, over years of dinners exactly like this one, to simply continue eating while I was quietly erased from the conversation. I set down my own fork. "It's fine," I said. I stood, folded my napkin with more care than the moment required, and placed it beside my plate. "Please enjoy dinner." No one asked me to stay. No one called after me as I walked down the hallway, past the framed photographs of a family history I had never quite been written into, and out into the night air. I didn't argue. I didn't explain, because there is a particular futility in trying to defend yourself to people who have already written the conclusion. They are not waiting for new evidence. They are waiting for you to finish speaking so they can confirm what they already decided. I had learned this about people like Margaret and Robert a long time ago. They didn't dismiss me because they knew me. They dismissed me because knowing me had never seemed necessary. I got in my car, drove home, opened my laptop, and went back to work. 3 days passed. I had almost returned to the ordinary rhythm of things. Early mornings, long calls, the quiet architecture of the work I did in the spaces between, when my phone rang on a Sunday afternoon. Margaret's number. I looked at it for a moment before I answered. In 3 years of marriage, she had called me directly perhaps 4 times. Each one had been an occasion of some kind, a birthday reminder, a change of plans, logistics dressed as conversation. She didn't call to talk, she called when something needed to be managed. I answered. "Hello, Margaret." "Hello," a pause, half a beat too long to be accidental. "Are you free this week? We'd like you to come over tomorrow if possible." Another pause. "There's something we need to discuss, a family meeting." Family meeting. 2 words she had never once directed at me before. "Of course," I said. "What time?" 2 o'clock. "I'll be there." She said goodbye and hung up. There was no warmth in it, but that wasn't new. What was new was the texture of her voice, careful, measured, scrubbed clean of the casual certainty that usually coated every word she spoke to me. Margaret was a woman who had always operated from a position of authority so total, so unexamined that she'd never had to think about her tone before. She thought about it now. People don't become careful unless they've learned something that makes carelessness dangerous. I put the phone down, sat for a moment in the quiet of the afternoon, and then opened my laptop. I logged into the dashboard, the one that tracked the holding structure, the entity registrations, the layered ownership that I had spent years architecting with the kind of patient, methodical precision that looks invisible until it isn't. Everything was intact. Clean, undisturbed. Good. Whatever they had found, and they had clearly found something, they had found only the surface, the waterline of something whose true depth they hadn't yet begun to measure. I thought about Daniel's face at that dinner, the way he had kept eating, the way his fork had moved so steadily, so automatically, from plate to mouth and back again, while his parents took turns holding my work up to the light and finding it wanting. I wondered who had gone looking. I wondered what they thought they'd found. I opened a folder on my desktop and began preparing documents. Not all of them, just the ones that were necessary. The ones that would say, without drama, without performance, exactly what needed to be understood. Control doesn't require loudness. It only requires clarity, and the patience to wait for the moment when clarity lands with the force of something unavoidable. I arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. There is a small power in punctuality that people rarely acknowledge. Arriving late signals that your time is more valuable than theirs. Arriving early signals anxiety, eagerness, and imbalance of need. Arriving exactly on time, calmly, without apology, signals something else entirely. It signals that you chose this moment, that nothing about this rattled you enough to scramble your timing. Margaret answered the door. She was wearing something pressed, which was also new for a Sunday at home. Robert was already in the sitting room, standing near the window with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, the posture of a man trying to project composure. Daniel sat on the sofa, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. He didn't look up when I walked in. That too was new. Daniel was not a man who struggled to maintain eye contact. He was, in most rooms, effortlessly confident in the way of someone who had never seriously been made to doubt himself. Watching him avoid my eyes had the quality of something significant, a tell, a fracture along a line I hadn't known was under pressure. I took a seat, set my bag beside my chair, not under it. I wanted it visible. I wanted them to know I'd brought something. For a long moment, no one spoke. 3 days ago, Margaret had filled a room without asking permission, opinions arriving fully formed, judgments deployed without preamble. Now she sat on the edge of her own chair and said nothing. Robert studied the middle distance. Daniel studied the floor. I waited. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat. "We wanted to," she began, then paused, as if field testing the sentence before committing to it. "We wanted to understand something." Understand. Not confront, not address, not discuss. Understand. The language of someone who has realized they are in possession of incomplete information and would very much like more before proceeding. "What exactly?" I asked. She glanced at Daniel. He still wasn't looking at me. "Your company," she said. Her voice was steady but lacked its usual ballast. "The one Daniel works at." "What about it?" Robert spoke then. "We heard some things about the ownership structure." I let that sit in the air for a moment. Who told you? I asked. Neither of them answered. Daniel shifted on the sofa, a small movement, the kind a person makes when they're trying to redistribute the weight of something uncomfortable. That's not important, he said. His voice was quieter than I was used to hearing it. It was important, but it would keep. For clarity, Margaret continued, her eyes steady on mine, you're saying you're involved with the company. Involved, as if ownership were a rumor you might be loosely affiliated with. I reach D into my bag, unhurried, the way you move when the outcome is already settled and the only variable is how much time it takes for everyone else to understand that. I withdrew a document, a single sheaf of pages, clean, printed on good paper, and placed it on the coffee table between us. I didn't push it toward them. I placed it in the neutral territory of the table and left it there. Let them decide to reach for it. That moment of reaching would matter. The silence that followed had a particular quality. It wasn't empty. It was the silence of people looking at something they hadn't expected, trying to calibrate how afraid to be. Daniel leaned forward first. He picked up the document, read the first line, and went completely still. Not the stillness of peace or comprehension. The stillness of a person whose body has momentarily stopped receiving instructions from a brain that is too busy rearranging its entire understanding of a situation it thought it had figured out. What is this? His voice was different, thinner, not the voice he used at dinner or in meetings or in the easy, unguarded moments of morning. This was the voice of someone trying to locate solid ground. It's the ownership filing, I said. He read. His parents read over his shoulder, three heads bowed over the same pages, moving at different speeds. Robert was the fastest. He'd been in business long enough to know what to look for. Margaret moved her lips slightly, the way she did when she was working through something she found difficult. No one spoke. They kept reading. I watched them read. There is something extraordinary about witnessing the moment when a person discovers that a story they've been telling about someone else was simply wrong. Not slightly off. Architecturally wrong. Built on a foundation that was never what they thought it was. Daniel looked up first. This can't be right. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if he were giving the document one last chance to correct itself. It is, I said. He shook his head. You don't, this company is publicly listed. There are shareholders, board members, you can't just, he stopped, because he didn't know how to finish the sentence. He didn't yet have a model for what he was looking at. You should keep reading, I said. He did, slower now, with the kind of care you apply to something when you've already been surprised once and don't want to be surprised again. His father leaned closer, reading the same section. And then Robert went still too. What is Harrison Holdings? Robert asked. His voice was measured, controlled. The voice of a man who has spent decades making decisions under pressure and knows how to keep his register even when his thoughts are moving fast. Mine, I said. He frowned, but that's not the company Daniel works for. No, I said, it's the company that owns it. That was when it landed. Not as an explosion, not the way revelation arrives in films, with a sudden swell of music and a close-up of someone's stunned expression. It arrived quietly, the way real things do. Like a key turning in a lock you didn't know existed. One moment the room had a certain shape, and in the next moment, without any visible change, it had an entirely different one. Margaret sat back in her chair. Her husband straightened slightly. And Daniel looked at the paper, then at me, and his face did something I had almost never seen it do. It became uncertain. You're saying, he started. You work for a company, I said, that answers to a structure I control. The room was very quiet. He looked back at the document. I watched him scan for the error, the mistake, the loophole, the thing that would make this not what it appeared to be. Lawyers do this. Auditors do this. People do it when they need the world to be the version they came in expecting. There was no error. How long? He asked. Since before we met, I said. What none of them understood, what I had never found the right moment or the right reason to explain, was how ordinary the architecture actually was. Not secret, exactly. disclosed correctly and completely to every person and institution that required disclosure. Structured through a private holding company, which held a controlling interest in a management entity, which in turn held the class of shares in the public company that, when assembled, constituted effective governance. The kind of structure that exists in every serious business environment in the world, used by families and funds and individuals who understand that visible ownership and operational control are not the same thing, and that the people who need to know already do. The people who didn't need to know simply hadn't asked. I had never hidden it. I had also never announced it. There is a version of transparency that involves telling everyone everything without prompting, and it is exhausting and strategically foolish, and frankly, not how anyone serious operates. What I had done was what every competent person in business does: disclosed to the right parties, documented everything correctly, and gone about my work. The work itself was not especially glamorous, and I had long ago stopped trying to make it sound so to people who weren't interested. There were boards to navigate, governance structures to maintain, quarterly obligations that required precision and attention. There were lawyers and accountants and advisors whose involvement ensured that every element of the structure was solid. And there was the daily, unglamorous, necessary work of managing something real, the kind of work that happens on laptops in home offices, on calls at early hours, in spreadsheets and filings, and review cycles that don't make for interesting dinner conversation. The kind of work Margaret had called pointless. Control doesn't always look like a title, I said. This was not directed at anyone in particular. It was simply something I had found true. Daniel looked up. What does that mean? It means, I said, that the people who need to understand who controls something understand it. Everyone else sees what they expect to see. Robert turned this over. I could see him doing it. If this is accurate, and I'm not saying it isn't, why wouldn't it be common knowledge? It is, I said, among the people it needs to be common knowledge for. He didn't like that answer. He wasn't sure how to argue with it either. Margaret had been quiet for a while. Now she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not warmth, not affection, but something more complex. Something that might, in a different version of our history, have been respect. Daniel works there, she said softly. He's been there for years, he would have known. No, I said, he wouldn't. And that was true, not because anyone had hidden it from him specifically, but because Daniel had never looked. He had arrived at that company through a headhunter, interviewed for a position, been offered it, taken it. Done his job well by all accounts, his performance reviews were excellent, his managers liked him. But he had never had occasion to look past the top layer of the company's ownership. And even if he had, the name he would have found at the end of that chain was a name he had never thought to connect to me. Because I had always been, to Daniel and his family, something that needed explaining. Something that needed to justify itself at dinner tables. Something that answered questions about what it amounts to. People see what they expect to see, what they've been taught to see. And Daniel had been raised by parents who had taught him, with perfect consistency, that ambition in a woman looked a certain way, usually his mother's way, which involved organizing the domestic sphere with extraordinary competence while deferring to Robert on anything that counted as serious. Anything else was, at best, a hobby. At worst, a vanity. He had married me, and absorbed me into that framework, without ever really examining whether I fit it. Now he was examining. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. I had known this question was coming. I had prepared for it the way you prepare for something that is inevitable but not simple, not with a canned answer, but with an honest understanding of the real answer, and whether it was one I wanted to give. You never asked, I said. The room took that in. Margaret shifted. Robert looked at his hands. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, and behind his eyes I could see something turning, something slow and difficult, the kind of recalibration that doesn't happen all at once but begins here, in a moment like this, and continues for a long time afterward. That's not, he started. That's not how it works. You don't wait for someone to ask if there's something important about your life that they should know. Isn't it? I said. Because in 3 years, you've been at 100 dinners where the question was, what does your work amount to? And you never once asked me to explain it. You kept eating. He didn't answer that. I reached into my bag again. Another document, placed it on the table, slightly closer to them this time. For further clarity, I said, this outlines the executive authority structure of the holding entity. Robert picked it up before anyone else could. He read the first page in silence, then passed it wordlessly to Daniel. Margaret leaned over to see. This time the silence was different, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of people reading something that is reorganizing the architecture of a situation they thought they understood. Daniel read. He went still again, differently this time. It says indirect oversight, he said slowly, through the holding board. Yes. That's not, operationally, I report to my direct manager. There are governance rules. There are, I said, which is precisely why I'm not in your day-to-day, th. E-firewalls are real, the governance is real. A flicker of relief crossed his face. I let it settle for exactly 1 second. And why, I said. He looked at me. This next part matters, I said quietly. I moved the final page forward on the table, the one I had printed last, the one I had considered carefully before including. It was a single paragraph, excerpted from the Executive Authority Framework, highlighted in a thin yellow bar across the most significant sentence. Executive authority includes compliance escalation and personnel review when risk is identified. Daniel didn't reach for it. He read it from where he was sitting. What risk? His voice had dropped. I met his eyes. Conflict of interest, I said. Material non-disclosure. He frowned. What are you? You used internal project timelines to inform outside negotiations, I said. My voice didn't change. It was the same register I'd used through the whole conversation, even, clear, unhurried. You discussed pending contracts at home, on at least 3 occasions that I can document, with dates and call records. You signed documentation containing non-disclosure obligations that you didn't read carefully enough to understand the scope of. The room was absolutely still. Margaret was the first to speak. What does that mean? She looked between me and Daniel, and her voice was stripped now, the careful control of it was gone, and underneath was something much more human. Worried. It means, I said, there is now a record. Daniel pushed his chair back a few inches. Not standing up, just creating distance. The instinct of a person who needs more space between themselves and a thing that has become suddenly very large. You're twisting this, he said. Everyone talks about work at home, that's not. Not like that, I said. That's normal. Not with someone who was simultaneously being approached by competitors in the same space. It isn't, I said. Not when the conversations included specific language about contract timing. His jaw tightened. You were taking notes on our conversations. I was documenting what I observed, I said. Because I have governance obligations that require me to. When I identified a pattern that constituted potential material non-disclosure, I was obligated to create a record. He stopped, looked at his parents. His father was watching him with an expression Daniel clearly hadn't expected from that quarter, not defense, not outrage on his behalf. Something quieter and more devastating. The look of a man who has heard enough to understand that his son has been careless. Robert exhaled slowly. What exactly are you saying? He asked me. Spell it out. I'm saying, I replied, that there are documented instances in which internal company information, protected information, governed by signed obligations, was discussed in environments and with parties outside of authorized channels. The dates are on record. The substance is on record. Outside parties, Margaret repeated. Who? Daniel's silence answered before he could. I see, Robert said. I reached into my bag one final time. A single page, clean, formatted, brief. I placed it in front of Daniel, close enough that he couldn't pretend not to see it, couldn't let his eyes slide off it the way eyes sometimes try to slide off things that are too uncomfortable to meet directly. Pre-termination review, I said, answering the question he hadn't yet asked. His mother's breath caught. You're not serious. The process is serious, I said. Whether I am or not is beside the point. Daniel stared at the page. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the words. Stop, move back, stop again. The way you read something when every sentence has a weight you need to set down before you can lift the next one. He looked up. For the first time since I had walked in, he looked at me fully. Not the sidelong glance of avoidance, not the performative eye contact of someone trying to seem unbothered. He looked at me the way you look at something that has turned out to be entirely different from what you thought it was, and you need to see it clearly because you are going to have to make a decision about it. What happens now? He asked. I held his gaze. Now it stops being a conversation and becomes a decision. Nobody moved for a moment. Because once something becomes a decision, people realize they are no longer in control of the pace of it. Conversation can be prolonged, deflected, walked away from. A decision that has been formalized, documented, dated, entered into a process, has its own momentum. What are my options? He asked. 3 days ago, this question would not have occurred to him. 2, I said, I didn't rush it, didn't soften it. Option 1, the matter proceeds through formal compliance channels. Internal review, board notification, independent investigation. The findings become part of the company's regulatory record. Permanent. Robert M. A small sound. He knew what that meant. Permanent meant discoverable. Discoverable meant that any future role, any board position, any serious professional engagement would carry the weight of it, not as an accusation, as a fact, a matter of record. Option 2, Daniel asked. His voice was very quiet. I took the last document from the folder, the one I had considered most carefully, drafted most precisely. I placed it in front of him. Resignation, I said. Effective immediately with a signed acknowledgement. Margaret inhaled sharply. You're forcing him out. I'm giving him control over how he leaves, I said. That's not forcing. That's the opposite of forcing. Forcing is what happens when you remove someone's choices. I am presenting him with choices. Daniel picked up the resignation document. He read it the way he'd read everything else tonight. Slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention he wished he'd applied to a few other documents at certain other moments in the past several years. What happens after, he asked, if I sign? Nothing dramatic, I said. You leave, quietly, with the acknowledgement that settles the record in a way that doesn't follow you further. And if I don't? I met his eyes, then it won't be quiet. That was all. No ultimatum delivered at volume. No speech. No performance of power. Just clarity, clean, precise, and complete. The kind of clarity that doesn't require anything to be added to it because it contains everything it needs. The room sat in silence for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 40 seconds. Robert was the first to look away. He walked to the window, stood with his back to the room, looking out at the garden he'd spent 30 years maintaining. I wondered what he was thinking. Whether he was thinking about Daniel, or about how this had happened, or about himself, about how much of what he'd assumed about me had been, simply, wrong. Margaret sat very still. She was looking at her hands, folded in her lap, and her face had the particular quality of someone who is rearranging something internally that is too large and too personal to rearrange in front of other people. She had called my work pointless. She had let her husband smirk. She had watched her son keep eating while his wife was quietly diminished, and she had not only permitted it, she had let it. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story where the woman who has been underestimated stands at the end of it in the glow of vindication, savoring the reversal. That version is satisfying in a particular way, but it is also small. It is the version told by someone who needed to win, and winning of that kind always costs something. What I felt was closer to settled. The way you feel when something that has been misaligned for a long time is finally brought into correct proportion. Not victory, accuracy. Daniel was still looking at the document. He turned it over, back, turned it over again. Not looking for something hidden, just moving, the way people move when they need time and their hands need something to do while their minds catch up. I never knew, he said finally, not to me, to the room, to himself. How is it possible that I never knew? Because, I said gently, and I mean that, I said it without edge, without satisfaction, you never looked. He turned that over too. I assumed, he said. Yes. I assumed I knew what you were. Yes. He put the document down, picked up the pen from the table, where it had been sitting since he'd picked it up, and set it down 10 minutes ago, when he'd thought he might argue his way out instead. He looked at me one last time. I had expected, in this moment, that I might feel the need to say something. Some final thing that would clarify or comfort or close the gap between what we'd been and what we were now. Some sentence that would make this make sense in a human way rather than a structural one. But there wasn't anything to say that the documents hadn't already said better. He signed. I drove home in the late afternoon, the light coming in sideways through the trees that lined their street, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly like it matters. I thought about what had happened in that room, and about all the rooms that had come before it. The dinners and the comments and the careful, cumulative architecture of being underestimated. The forks kept moving. The glasses set down with precision. The husband who kept eating. I thought about the first time I had walked into a boardroom and been handed the coffee order by a man who assumed I was someone's assistant. About the first investor call where I'd had to establish, quietly and without irritation, that I was not in attendance as a courtesy but as the principal. About the years of doing the work in rooms where the work was either invisible or discounted, and deciding, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long accumulation of moments, that visibility was not the goal. The goal was the holding structure. Let people see what they expect to see. Let them dismiss the laptop, the early calls, the years of patient, careful work. Let them call it pointless over rosemary lamb and a glass of good wine. The structure doesn't change because someone at a dinner table doesn't understand it. The ownership filing doesn't rearrange itself because a mother-in-law has decided you don't amount to anything. What I had built was not loud. It had never been loud. But it had been, from the beginning, designed to last, to function correctly, to hold weight, to remain intact precisely in the moments when it was most needed. Control is not the loudest voice in the room. Control is the person who prepared the documents. Control is the person who chose the moment, not because the moment was imposed on them, not because they were provoked into it, not because they had run out of other options, but because the moment was exactly right, and they had been ready for it for a very long time. Control is the person who walked into that room at 2 o'clock exactly, set their bag on the table, and waited. Control doesn't announce itself. It arrives, it shows you the documents, it gives you the pen. And then it waits, the way it has always waited, patient, certain, and entirely unhurried. Because in the end, control isn't loud. It's final.